Um, we're going to, so just to kick off, as I said, this is the Involve and NESTA Community Engagement Seminar Series. It's part of NESTA's Creative Councils program, which is a very interesting program looking at innovation in local government. So there's 17 councils around the country doing such an amazingly interesting array of projects ranging from community-run transport, children in care, looking at issues around community organizing and everything in between. It's a huge range of projects, very interesting work. And as part of the support provided, we've teamed up to provide these webinars on topics that council staff have chosen themselves. So this is the second in the series. And in 2 weeks' time, it's every 2 weeks. In 2 weeks' time, we'll have another webinar, which is going to be also very interesting. It will be Mary Reid talking about community engagement and elected members. Now, Mary's got a tremendous amount of experience as an elected councillor with online engagement, all kinds of things. So if you're interested in that, how do we engage with politicians, then do tune in 2 weeks' time. But before that, we're going to do this week's seminar, which is an absolutely fascinating topic, one that I find very interesting myself. We're going to be talking about positive deviance. Positive deviance is one of those interesting cases of a project which just, or an approach which just turns things on its head and takes something, a seemingly intractable problem, and solves it with community by looking at the uncommon or deviant behavior that some individuals or groups within communities develop to provide better solutions. Now, it's a fascinating approach. It's still very new in the UK, but it's already delivered some really astounding results. And I'm absolutely thrilled because we have two people here who are probably the best people placed to explain what this is in the UK. We've got Jane Lewis and Sue Ritchie. So just a few words of introduction. We've got, starting with Jane Lewis. Jane is a real pioneer of positive deviance in the UK. She's been running most, if not all, of the positive deviance projects so far. She's got really interesting work around adult care services, around community engagement, around crime, and many other issues. Seen some real impressive results. She's a lecturer at Oxford University, Oxford Brookes, and HEC Paris. Really strong track record, and really, as I said, very well placed for positive deviance in the UK. And she's got strong links back to the Positive Deviance initiative in Boston, the States, and is well networked internationally. Sue Ritchie is Director of Mutual Gain. She's also an Involved Associate, and she's just got a tremendous amount of experience of community engagement. While she was Head of Engagement at Tower Hamlets, she won the first, she secured the only CEA Green Flag in participation, 2009, won the first LGC Award in Community Involvement. So again, tremendous amount of experience. I'm really chuffed we've got not one, but both of them to partake in the webinar. And without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Sue, who will start off the content of the presentation. And I, for one, will be listening with great interest.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yeah, I think we can hear you.
Yeah, good. Okay, then I shall start. Okay, what we're going to do today is give you an overview of what positive deviance is, and hopefully give you an opportunity to ask as many questions as you can about it, because experience tells us that it requires a different way of thinking, which means we have to ask each other lots of questions all the time. But what we're going to do is talk about some current barriers to effective engagement and community action, and that's based on over 10 years of my trying to engage communities in a more productive way than we have done in the past. What positive deviance is, what it's achieved, so Jane will talk to you about some of the case studies that she's been involved in and why it's different, and what lessons and inspirations we've learned over the last 18 months or so since we started a big Home Office pilot on this. So feel free to ask your questions online, and then when we've got a convenient slot, we'll try and answer those as best we can. Okay, so The challenge for us, I think, around positive deviance is, and the way we think is, it's a change process that happens naturally and wins and keeps converts. So, you know, historically we've done lots of community engagement work, but we might have to work very hard to keep people engaged after that process. What positive deviance does is because it works on what people do naturally and the spreading of natural practice, it means that you don't have to work as hard. I think Jane might argue with me on this, but that you don't have to work as hard in the long run, because it is about behavioural change. It's not just about community engagement. And it's something that uses people's natural networks, brings people together and creates that environment for solving what are intractable problems. So you would use this methodology for something that is making you scratch your head, really. It's a complex process, you're not quite sure of the solutions, so let's try something different. Now, the reason why I've been involved in this is just to give you a bit about my background. I used to be in academia, and I used to work a lot with students who were from non-traditional backgrounds, where we would emphasise the learning process of experiential learning. My job there was to look at the role of, or teach the theory of citizenship, if you like. So what is the relationship between the state and the individual, and what's the type of dialogue that needs to happen in order to bring those two together more productively. So I used to teach from an academic perspective, and then I'm not really an academic, so I much prefer the practical, and so went to work for Tower Hamlets Council to set up a service around improving the way we engage with Tower Hamlets residents. And those of you that know Tower Hamlets residents will know that that's a fairly diverse community with all sorts of challenges. So over those years I've been working with different communities within the context of a council and wider partnership, a local strategic partnership, where we managed all the different strategic themes. And we looked about what the, oops, hang on, that's my phone, which I didn't turn off, sorry. We looked at different ways in which we would engage communities, and looked at how we built the capacity of staff within an organisation to engage communities better. And I just listed some bullet points there for you, just to sort of, not to say whether any of these are good or bad, but just factually, this is what we do. So we focused a lot on communication, a kind of top-down process of telling people what we were doing, raising awareness, building campaigns to encourage people to change their behaviour and work more closely with us. We developed structures of community engagement, some informal, some formal, but most of you will be familiar with the more formal structures of community forums, panel meetings, that kind of thing. We worked closely with leaders within the community, so, you know, the imams, the faith leaders, the active residents in the Tenants Residents Association, and those sorts of leaders. We also invested a lot of money over those years. I mean, I can't believe the amount of money actually that we spent on community engagement over those years, which arguably was never really evaluated, and not the lessons not really captured as well as they could have been over those years, to really see what does work with certain communities and what doesn't. So what did I learn from all of those years in local government and across partnership working? I learned that there are lots of things we did which were really very good, but they weren't necessarily about behavioural change. And I'm talking about behavioural change on a bigger scale, not just the small scales, where whole communities start to change their behaviour and act differently, so there's better outcomes, and we don't need to spend as much money on providing statutory services. All of the things which I guess come under the big society now, whether you agree with big society or not, but that kind of devolving of power. And the lessons that I learned is it's not so much about money, although money is really important. I do think it does, what people do need to understand is good community engagement can sometimes mean you need to invest in starting that process up and catalysing the process, but eventually you shouldn't need to spend very much money on it, because people will naturally feel more empowered and take ownership of the process. So I think we invested quite a lot of money in things which I didn't always think were as productive as they could have been. I learnt that there are a lot of guardians out there, even those which we still see as community leaders, that sometimes they are the gatekeepers to real communities. So I remember having experiences with communities where they told me this is what the community wanted, and conveniently that fitted with a particular funding stream, as opposed to necessarily saying what the community really did want. So the challenge for me was, how do I get to real communities, the real voice of the community, and not necessarily work through an interested guardian which has got an interest from a funding perspective. And that was quite challenging at times. The other thing that I saw which bothered me slightly was the repetition of particular methods which weren't necessarily repeated in the way that they should be, I guess. So when I went to town hamlets, I heard a lot of people telling me they were doing focus groups. Now, take your mind back, that was sort of 1997, when Tony Blair sort of really kicked off the let's do focus groups to understand the public, and of course that became the buzzword. And in the council everyone was saying they were doing focus groups, but when I went to actually look at them, they weren't focus groups at all. They were workshops, or they were presentations to the community telling them what they were doing. So that started to make me think, hang on, people aren't really understanding what the word means, and behind each of those terminologies there's a whole methodology, and the methodology is not being employed. So if somebody does a focus group but it's not really a focus group and it doesn't work, then they dismiss focus groups. But actually each of those methodologies are good, fit for purpose, so long as you know the reason why you're engaging that community and you use the right methodology. And I didn't see an awful lot of that. I saw I saw a lot of people not being clear about why they wanted to engage the community, and then even if they were clear about why they wanted to engage the community, not necessarily using the right method for that purpose, but using what seemed to be what the latest trend was. And like I say, what I didn't see an awful lot of was wide-scale behavioural change. So when I left Tower Hamlets and went to work for the Home Office, and you're thinking then my main focus was crime, and I'd moved away from the kind of other areas of partnership working, and of course crime's a really complex problem there, right? It's not straightforward cause and effect. It requires partnership work, and it requires a lot of complex thinking. But ultimately you need to get people to change their behaviours. You need to stop committing crime so that we become safer. So I was interested when we were doing the community engagement work there, we did some pilots there on how we change behaviours, and came across an area in Gosport who had done their action plan. And as I was going to meet them, I was reading through the action plan, and tucked away right at the back was this little reference to, and we'll be doing some positive deviance. And of course, because of my experiences that I've just told you about, I was interested in, what is this then? Is this a new methodology, or is it a new word for something that we already do? So I raised that when I met with Gosport, and because of the nature of where I was at, I guess, Home Office, we were able to focus on that and really learn some lessons from it. So that was a very small pilot, and then we were able to make the case to do a much bigger pilot in three bigger areas on a very complex issue like domestic violence. So that's where the main pilot has taken place, in those 3 areas around domestic violence. And people criticised us at the start, saying, why would you test a methodology like this on something so difficult? I guess positive deviance is a methodology you only use when you've got a complex problem. You wouldn't use it if it's a straightforward problem. So domestic violence isn't straightforward, that's complex. My theory was, well, if it can work in domestic violence, it can work with anything, really. And if it doesn't work with domestic violence, at least we'll be able to capture the lessons around that and then test it on other areas of crime. So I'm hoping that, I know that I've talked a lot there, but I'm hoping that gives you a context of how I came to be involved in that and work closely with Woodward-Lewis about what positive deviance means. And I think that Jane will probably confirm that I've driven her mad over the last sort of year or 18 months saying, yes, but I'm not interested if it's just good community engagement. What I want to know is how it's different from other community engagement, and I want to know where it's different in order to encourage behavioural change. Because there's a tendency when I work with people across the country is that feel-good factor. When you've had a good meeting with a community, it feels really good, and it feels really good from everybody's perspective. But it doesn't necessarily mean things are going to change, and it doesn't mean it was actually good and sound methodology. It might just mean those people liked each other and managed to get on with each other in the room, but it might not be replicable. So I'm probably the person that sits on Jane's shoulder nagging her all the time about the purity of the methodology. That's one of the things that we're trying to work through at the moment, because there are some lessons that have been learnt about the UK example of positive deviance, and there's a big question mark about whether we use those lessons and adapt to what's already happening and adapt to that context, which of course would be good practice, or whether we stick to the methodology, which again is good practice. And my concerns are sometimes that when people tweak, they tweak away until they get what they had before, and that's where my concern comes in. That I wouldn't want this methodology, which is tried and tested and has worked in really difficult circumstances, I wouldn't want it tweaked away until it becomes what everybody in the UK seems to be much more happy with, and that's what they had before. So that's what we're trying to make sure we don't do in the next few months as the lessons learned from that pilot roll out. So I'll shut up now, and I'll let Jane talk you through some of the case studies that have happened internationally and in the UK.
Fantastic, thanks Sue. Before we hand over to Jane, I just wanted to do a few things. Firstly, the number of attendees has doubled since we started, so that's great news. So I just wanted to reiterate the welcome to everyone. So welcome, this is, for those of you who, hopefully you all know where you are, but if you don't, this is the second Creative Councils webinar organized by Involve. Creative Councils is a NESTA and LGA program. It's a fascinating program. There's lots of stuff on the joint program. It's got lots of interesting, innovative work going on. It's really worth checking out online. These webinars are here to provide interesting, compelling information about new developments in public engagement. Today we're talking about positive deviance. I'm really pleased we've got Jane Lewis and Sue Ritchie, two of the probably best placed people to talk about these issues. So welcome and thank you to NESTA and LGA for making these webinars possible. Also, to let you know, since it is a webinar, there will be question and answer sessions further on. In order to make that as quick as possible, it would be great if you can write your questions while you're listening to the presentation in the chat box on the webinar panel. So feel free to do that. That'll go to Annie. She will collate them and then she will she'll allocate the work. And obviously, you can ask a question by raising your hand using the little button for that in real time. But I'd really encourage you to submit questions while the presentation goes on. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jane, who will continue the presentation.
Thank you very much. Just to give you an overview of what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you some set the scene in terms of what positive deviance is all about and some of the key concepts, at which point we can probably pause for questions again. Then I'm going to go on to talk about some of the case studies that we've been involved in, we being me and Sue, and some other we's, which is my team at Woodward-Lewis, that we've been doing around the country. And then we'll be pulling the sort of themes together in terms of what the lessons learned, and as Sue said, and absolutely rightly, that she sits on my shoulder being my conscience and making sure that we're doing not just the right thing and doing things right. So that's really how the rest of the webinar will roll out. Anyway, moving on, Positive deviance is often taught using stories, and storytelling is a very important part of the whole process. So I'll start with a story. The person who taught me is a guy called Jerry Sternin, and he worked for Save the Children America, and he was sent by them to Vietnam because they'd realized that they had a critical problem. They had 65% of their young children were malnourished. And he was sent there, however, without any money or without the facility for getting aid parcels, and therefore he had to resort to native cunning and his own intelligence to do something about it. And he remembered some work that had been done in nutrition about finding people who were coping and sharing practices. So he moved on and got the ladies who were weighing the children in Vietnam, and particularly in this first village where he stopped, to start to ask questions of parents when they brought the children to be weighed. And he got them to design the questions, which were about the kind of socio-economic status they had, and they essentially boiled down to poor, very poor, and extremely poor. And he asked the ladies to weigh the kids, ask the question about the socio-economic status, and plot the results on a kind of very basic scattergram. And then at the end of the week they looked at the results together, and he asked the question, so are there any children who seem to be better nourished than the others? And there were clearly spread that there were. And where are they in terms of their socioeconomic status? And they discovered that in each group there were children who were better nourished than their peers. So this was a huge excitement for the villagers, and the next stage was to find out a bit more about that. So more villagers were recruited to go and do an inquiry and observation process. They asked a lot more about the detail of how the children were fed. They visited everybody to find out what the norm was, just to confirm that, but also to find out what these positively deviant practices might be in a lot of detail. And they reported back, and there was a whole jigsaw puzzle of different things, but some of the key ones were that some of the parents fed the children not just the norm, which was rice, but also shrimps and crabs that they'd fished out of the paddy fields. Other parents fed their children sweet potato tops. Others got their grandparents in, and instead of feeding them, as was the norm, twice a day at the beginning and the end of the day, the grandparents fed the small children a middle meal. They only still had the same amount of rice per family, but the fact that it was divided into 3 rather than 2 meant that little tummies were able to deal with it a lot better. And this, together with a number of other practices, were put together, and the group realised that there may be correlation between the practices and the weight. So the next stage was to invite villagers to come and try the new food and to get their children weighed. There was an incentive. Each family got a bag of rice if they brought the children all week. And over the course of the week, the parents could see that as the children ate the new diet, they were getting a bit more bouncy even before the difference showed on the scales. And by the end of the weeks, they could start to see a difference between the children who were coming in terms of weight to be fed and those who were being weighed but not being fed the new diet. So the word got round in the village, and more people came to try the new diet, and eventually they asked the parents, would you be willing to learn how to do this new feeding? And they signed up and said yes. So the villagers worked together and taught each other how to do this new cooking, and 5 years later, when a study team went back to that particular village, they discovered that all the parents who had learnt the new cooking was continuing to feed subsequent children the new diet, and they were also teaching new parents how to do the same thing. And this particular approach is now widely used worldwide with malnutrition. In that particular village, it reduced malnutrition from 65% right the way down to something like 20%. So there was a significant impact. And this has been replicated all around the world, from Bolivia to Mali to Indonesia. Each time the solutions are different. They probably would be different in the next village in Vietnam as well. And the point is that it's those little differences that make so much difference and that can unlock solutions that people didn't realize were there. And this is all based on the principle that in every community there are people whose unusual practices or behaviours enable them to find better solutions to problems than their neighbours who have access to exactly the same resources. This is absolutely critical. But these people aren't obvious in the community, and one of the things that we find with positive deviance is that people take it to be the sort of out there mavericks that are sort of noticeably doing something different. But actually it's usually really quiet people who don't know they're doing something different, or who are worried that what they're doing isn't the right thing. So as Sue mentioned, there is a process, and it's about making sure that this does work. I'm not going to go into it into a huge amount of depth, but it is based very much on facilitation and questioning. And the first two of these stages take the longest time, first of all, to find the right people and the right problem, and then actually getting data around that. The whole of the PD, as we call it, approach is absolutely bathed in data. Data collection is absolutely fundamental, as you can see from the Vietnam story, and we'll look at how that happens in the case studies. After that, the other stages actually happen extremely quickly, and then it's about how can you take what's learned and use the skills that have been developed to actually scale it up. One of the things that I've found, and unlike Sue, I don't come from a community engagement background, is how different the way of being and thinking that underpins positive deviance is from traditional community engagement practice. And for this reason, we've found that we've actually got very good wins very early on, even just from the first couple of stages, because they do this approach tends to get people involved who are not traditionally the people that are seen to be community leaders, as Sue said. But there is a 5-step process, as I've just showed you, and there are a range of tools and techniques which are primarily coaching and facilitation techniques that you would use in the process. So, to underpin this new, different way of thinking, these are some of the key concepts that always need to be at the forefront of a positive deviance facilitator's mind. The first one is about ownership, not buy-in. People have to frame the problem to be tackled in a way that they own, rather than buy into somebody else's definition of the problem. And the design of the way that this is done is co-created with community groups who are trained, but it's their choice how they actually take things forward. Another underpinning concept is that actually community people do know what they're talking about. They are experts by virtue of their experience, so the group you're working with is the guru. It's not about telling people what to do, and although this creates a great deal of anxiety, actually community groups and the method ensures that risks are assessed, because most people want to do the things that will genuinely help rather than do risky things. Another key concept, which is allied to the previous two, is don't decide about me without me. So if people are going to be asked to do something different, it's about making sure that they're brought into the process at some appropriate point. Not everybody in the whole community needs to be involved in it all the way through, but at key points there's an outreach process. One of the key things that I've found powerful, and actually was the main thing that got me involved in this, is that I've always found it's far easier to get people to try and do something to change their behaviour, whereas so many things that happen are all about trying to get people's minds or heads right before actually trying to do something. And positive deviance is extremely practical. So, as again in the Vietnam example, you get people to try something in a safe environment to see if it works before you actually let them loose on doing something, even if they think it's all a load of baloney, basically, that you can still get people to try something, and as you can see, incentives play a part in this. But the whole ethos around this is very inclusive, so people working together will, tend to be a little more adventurous in trying new things. The other thing about this, which is fundamentally different from many different community engagement approaches, is that it focuses on the what and the how, not the why. So again, in Vietnam, you'll see that they didn't try and eradicate poverty, which was the underpinning problem. They just tried to make some differences by giving people a bit of headroom and a bit of hope, by focusing very much on the practice and the detail of that practice, not the reasons why people were not feeding their children properly. So that's the sort of key run through the key concepts. I've got a kind of placeholder slide here, so if people want to feedback initial reactions or ask questions, that would be great.
So if you just want to, if you do want to make a comment or a question, if you just put your hand up, there's a little picture of a hand, and if you just press that, then we can unmute you and you can talk to Jane and Sue. Or if not, we can continue on. Maybe everything's perfectly clear.
Okay, I'm assuming that I'm not getting questions coming through at the moment. Okay, so I'll move on to the case studies. Oh, Sue wanted to... I think you're unmuted, Sue, if you want to talk.
Hi, Sue, are you there? I think we might be having some technical problems. She's definitely unmuted, so...
Can you hear me?
Ah, there we are.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes? Can everybody hear me?
Yes, yes, they can.
Okay, jolly good. I just wanted to add in a couple of things there. When Jane was talking about the Vietnam example where they used the rice, one of the things that I found really powerful when I was reading about that example was when the people were adding shrimps to their rice. To you and I, that seems like, you know, okay, so what, the kind of thing. But actually, the deviant part of that was that putting shrimps in their rice was like adding slugs to lettuce for us. So they were kind of packing out the rice, if you like, not necessarily knowing that the shrimps were good for them. So I just thought that was really fascinating, because that's a, you know, a deviant thing to do, if you like, but with real positive outcomes. And I guess the big message that I think underpins all of that is we don't know who the positive deviants are. So one of the things that I first encountered with positive deviants and people's reactions to it was, okay, so that's like what we have, community champions or community leaders, and usually they're not those people. We start with community champions or leaders, that kind of thing, to try and catalyse the process, but positive deviants themselves are not they don't normally have their head above the parapet. They're not walking around the community saying, I've done this, I've resolved this problem. They need to be discovered by people. So I just thought it was worth adding that in as well. And the other point is that it's a bit about the what and the how, and not the why, which I think's really important just to emphasise at this stage, because in the policy making arena we quite often think about the why and think about the really big picture, but actually what Positive Deviance does is it just goes straight in there and looks for practical ways in which we can solve some of these problems without major campaigns. And one of the stories I use to try and emphasise that is, if you think over the years how many health campaigns there have been about losing weight and how we need to eat healthy, 5 a day and all of that, most people know that message now, and so it's been really good to have that comms campaign, if you like, that gets the message out. But it doesn't always mean that people change their behaviours. So I am an overweight person, and I'm more than aware that I should eat 5 a day, and I'm more than aware that I should lose a bit more weight and I should exercise a little bit more. But just because you tell me to do it doesn't mean I'm going to do it. The power lies in me changing my behaviour when I see somebody else do something that's really successful, and there's someone who's known to me who I didn't realise would do that. You know, I'm surprised when I see my friends say, oh, I've just lost 3 stone. How did you do that? Oh, it was, you know, Weight Watchers or whatever. and then I might be inclined to go and copy her and do what she's doing as well. And I think that's what Positive Deviance works on, that basis. It finds the people that have solved problems and not really known that they're solving some of those problems. So it was just to sort of emphasise that practical element to that.
Thank you very much, Sue. Can everybody hear me now? Okay. We've had a question about filtering opinions to get to a consensus, but I was going to ask Mike if I can keep that for later, because I wanted to move on to some examples which might show how that's been done in the particular cases that we're about to talk about. Okay, so I'll move on to the case studies. Depending on time, and I'm looking at my colleagues here to make sure that I keep to time, I've got 3 different case studies to talk to you about. The first one is linked to the Home Office pilot that Sue was talking about. This is where we were working with domestic abuse, and we had the 3 different areas. This particular one was from Wales, and it was done in partnership with the local domestic abuse advisory service, and they were trained how to facilitate the process and took it away and did it for themselves. So the first stage is to get consensus about what the problem is, and the domestic abuse service has actually recruited a number of young people, a group of about up to 24 people altogether, but a core of about 15 or 16, most of whom were young, but the group covered all age groups and was representative of the whole of the community, which was quite an insular one. They were in South Wales, and they thought that Cardiff and Newport were foreign, so they were quite an isolated community. Working with this group of people, they brainstormed out what the issues were around domestic abuse. Most of the people in the group had been touched by domestic abuse in some way. And they decided that the one that they could do most about was the fact that people do not talk about domestic abuse, which means that victims and survivors become very isolated. So this was the problem they chose to work on. And they checked their opinions out, which is part of the methodology, with the rest of the community at a big participatory budgeting event that they also did. And they discovered, taking the data, that everybody there was a significant majority agreed that people don't talk about domestic abuse, and it was a problem worth tackling. So they carried on with their work, and they looked at the kind of issues that people with domestic abuse have, and they developed their own rock, paper and scissors exercise. The rock bit, unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of, but essentially what they did was to have a kind of pumice stone that you normally use in the bath. And one of the group of young people held it up and asked, "What do you see?" And it's a fairly boring grey piece of rock. Then she turned it over, and on the other side she glued a lot of little sparkly gems, and she used that to explain that in every community, although it looks quite possibly normal and boring on the outside, there are all sorts of wonderful things going on the other side. So that was the rock. Then they went on to the paper to actually write down the key things that they thought were the main aspects of the problem, the different facets of people not talking, and that was the paper. And then they cut up the things that they really wanted to deal with and threw away the paper with a bit of the things that they felt either they couldn't do anything about or that it wasn't worth talking about. And they said that although it actually brought them down, it really sort of lifted them up afterwards to realise that they were left with some things that really mattered to them to tackle, and that they felt they could tackle it. And these are the kind of things that they felt was the reason that people didn't talk, and that they needed to find out people who got through that and enable people to talk for themselves. So they went on an inquiry and observation exercise, and they found some positive deviance in the community, and they worked out what it was about them that made them good at getting people to open up. And they did this analysis, and they came up with these different skills, essentially. They also recognised that actually there were some underpinning beliefs behind the behaviours, that the positive deviants actually were aware of how much of an issue it was, so raising awareness was still important. But they also didn't feel any kind of obligation to solve the issue, and would refer people on to the professionals. So that was very important, and I think that was actually quite an insightful piece of work to do, because one of the sort of drivers, people want to aim really high and solve everything, but actually it's about taking this in small and incremental steps. So that was their sort of risk minimization strategy. So what they did last, I suppose, they decided that replicating the positive deviance behaviours in a safe environment would be the best way of doing this, and that they, the group of 16 to 24, would be the positive deviants who take and use that behaviour to get people to open up. So what they did is they set up a Big Brother diary room to replicate the kind of environment where people opened up and the kind of questions people responded to, and they invited people in and just gave them some prompts to start them talking. And their project reached over 200 people, and during the course of the project there was a 15% increase of reported incidents of domestic violence during the period of the pilot. Now the thing that actually made the most impact to me, and also to a lady called Rosie who came with me from the Home Office, was that they actually showed us the video of one of the conversations that actually happened. And one of the things, I've never been so moved, I have to say, it was to see this mother and her daughter both talking about their lives and suddenly both realising that both of them were actually in an abusive situation, which had never ever surfaced before, and they just accepted that that was what life was all about. And you know, as you, I'm sure, is no surprise to anybody, that the history was already repeating itself. So seeing that awareness suddenly dawn, and knowing that they set up an environment where people could be referred straight in to get help, was an extremely moving experience, and it was you know, a very creative way of actually helping people to take a step out of an abusive situation. Now that was one of the three, and in other areas in Cambridgeshire there was a significant change in the way that the agencies and the authorities conceived of and worked with survivors of domestic violence. We have had very positive feedback from both the police and the county council about how much they realised that if you do recognise that people are survivors and treat them as somebody who has had a really bad experience but has vast amounts of potential, that they can actually do a lot more and can actually be less demanding on the system. So one of the ladies who worked on the Cambridge project, their outcome was to, if you like, renegotiate the kind of contract between the council and the police. But they also did do communications campaigns and bring people in a different sort of voice than was normally used. And one of the ladies wants to do a positive deviance exercise in the Muslim community to reach out to people who are in sort of as wife number two, to help them realise that that is potentially abusive, and that from the county council's point of view is costing them quite a lot of money and benefits. So that was some examples from the domestic violence project, and I'm planning to carry on with the case studies, but I can stop for questions if I'm told that there's a lot.
There's just one at the moment. Do you want to do that now or wait till a bit later? Sue's suggesting doing it now. Shall we hear from Andy McGregor?
Okay, Andy is asking.
Hi, Andy.
Hear me now? Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. I was just saying really whether I've summarised it right, it seems to be that instead of using the sort of established community leaders who seem to be sometimes self-selecting and stick with the status quo, the main difference with the positive deviance is that the people whose examples that you follow are those who are sort of rationally assessed as doing something that's different and good.
Yeah, and what I was going to say, Andy, is it is kind of rationally assessed, and it's based on evidence and observation, and I think that observation and data collection process is what's quite different to our normal community engagement processes. So the community that decide to work on it might be your self-selected group, and sometimes it's just better to have them kickstart it, because if they're not involved in it from the start, as you'll know, sometimes that comes back at you and can be problematic. But actually, that aside, those people that are always involved have an energy and enthusiasm and are quite well connected. So it's good to use those to start off the process. But what it becomes very clear then is once they've collected the evidence and they've gone out and observed practice, is they realise that they aren't the positive deviants. Their role is something different in society. So yes, it is rational, but it's based on evidence and observation. So, you know, the other thing I was going to say when you go through the PD process is that one of the things that I think is a really valuable lesson to have learned is to get people in the right mindset for PD means people are more willing to accept, when I say people I mean policymakers here, means that policymakers seem to be more willing to accept where the community are at that point. So your norms differ, if you like. So when they go through the process of defining their question, sometimes the question they come up with is a question we already know the answer to as policymakers. And one of the examples Jane has, which you might do in a minute, is some single parents who had children who were either black or mixed race. And, you know, how many years have we known that, and research has shown us that young black males were more likely to be excluded from school, etc., and not achieve educational attainment, etc. But those single parents didn't know that, and so they were shocked by that as their evidence, and then because they were shocked by it, they were prepared to take that forward. So I think that's that early stage of positive deviance and the change in mindset around what question needs to be asked. When policymakers change their mindset and are willing to go with the question that the public want to ask rather than the questions that they want to ask, that's when you can get real change, and you can then get the evidence and rational selection of people that are really making a difference to the quality of life.
Isn't the key bit there, you said when policymakers change, because that almost implies they've made the policy and they do the consultation to get it approved.
That's exactly the
ownership rather than buying.
Yeah, my experience has been that's been a huge problem over the years, trying to get them to just wait and see what the community really want. And I know Jane could probably talk to you for hours on how difficult that was with the Home Office pilot, just getting people to change their mindset as policymakers and let go of control. Once they do it, it goes really quickly, but getting them to change their mindset takes sometimes 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, I can believe that. The other thing is that I'm sort of local council and town council. It's sometimes people are very reluctant to engage in dialogue with people with the aim of changing their mind, of changing people's views, giving them more information, as opposed to, you know, like a debate in a debating society. The aim is to influence people, whereas if we can't seem to alter what people want, they know what they want. Well, I don't think they do sometimes. Well, the non-positive deviants don't.
But if they feel like they've got power over the process and they own the process and it's about them, then they listen more, whereas our traditional methods are to go and tell people what we think we need them to do. Well, then there's no surprise then, the natural reaction is, yeah, okay, I'll do that then, and they never do.
Can I just butt in here into one of the things that we've found is that there's a number of different facets to the issue. There's the policymaker one, which is, yes, I can talk for hours, but I won't. And you're right, there is the one about the traditional community leaders not necessarily being the right people. But it is about, as we've said, using social networks. So whilst we might start with those what we tend to do is to use them as hubs in the network and find ways of getting through to people through non-traditional methods, shall we say, just by word of mouth as much as anything, to get people along and interested. The other issue with that also is to make sure that, as you say, sometimes people aren't clear about what they want, and that use of data to actually highlight a problem is very powerful indeed, and also to challenge myths, of which we can find many. And there's another example of malnutrition where in the developing world, where everybody was quite convinced that the reason for malnutrition and illness was a sorcerer, and there is, you know, Western equivalents of that particular sorcerer and that particular myth in all communities, and actually using the data tends to strip away the supposition, the assumptions, and get at what the real issue is. I hope that helps.
The other thing there is as well, what I learnt with the domestic violence pilots when I was working with some of the people at the start there, is when you tell people what a positive deviant is, most people want to be a positive deviant or can identify themselves as one that might be a little bit deviant, but you get positive outcomes at the end. And they want to take on that identity at the start. And the challenge is when you're working with those community leaders to remind them that you might not be the positive deviant, but what your role is to go and get some evidence and look at for factual data of where you might find positive deviance in your community. And that whole, you know, the kind of ego, the traditions that go with being a community leader make them sometimes want to be that positive deviant. But once they get that, then their role changes as well, and they really get quite excited about going to look for the evidence to find out where the positive deviants are in the community, and any resistance just falls away, I think.
Does that help, Andy?
Sorry.
Lost Andy.
Sorry, Andy, you should be back now.
Oh yeah, that's
Okay.
great. That's seems to sort of back up what I was thinking of it was, which is always nice to hear.
We've got a question from Lorna Prescott. If I read it out, Sue, perhaps you can see if you've got any thoughts about it. Have you come across any tensions between identifying and working with positive deviance and reinforcing structural and other forms of power which create inequalities? For example, are positive deviants sometimes people who have and use power that others don't?
It's unfortunate I can't talk to you, Lorna, because I probably want to ask you a bit more about what you meant by it. But in terms of using power, I think, and Jane, you can come in on this, I think that my experience of all the examples that I've read about and what I've seen are positive deviants don't tend to use power so much and might not necessarily be involved in any of the kind of traditional structures, but what they do is they cope in a very different way, and they find ways of getting around a problem or dealing with that problem which are produce positive outcomes, and they're kind of personality traits really, with some which end up in practical ways of doing things. So I'm not sure that they necessarily use power structures, because usually they're doing it in an unconscious way, if you like. So if you just think about parenting, and I know this is quite controversial, why we have some parents that seem to be able to bring their children up on the same estate with the same social issues that are going on, but nonetheless they're successful and they're able to avoid joining groups of people that commit crime or whatever. What the positive deviance process does is it will ask the community to go and collect data on that. So go and look, observe. So you train community leaders to observe in a very different way, and they'll be able to see things. Some of the simple things I've seen, not in a formal project actually, but just since I've been more familiar with this as a methodology, is where you see parents who might, they'll reinforce positive positive behaviour as much as they do negative behaviour. So for people that know about good parenting, of course we know that's the way to parent, don't we? It's reinforced positive as well as negative. But when you look at people, even if they're good professional people and they understand, they can talk the talk, but when you look at their practice, they might actually be just reinforcing negative behaviour all the time and not positive. And I've seen that quite a lot from, just friends, family, communities that I work with around the country. So the ones that are doing it well don't necessarily know that they're doing it well, and sometimes it can be just put it down to luck, and the job of Positive Deviance is to go and find those people who seem to look quite lucky and find out what it is that makes them lucky, I think, is what I'm trying to say. So I don't know if that's answered your question, but it doesn't tend to reinforce any other inequalities.
Okay. I haven't really got anything to add to that. An interesting comment from Amy McGregor. PBDs may be the sort of people who get on and do it rather than talking about it or going to meetings. So yes. Perhaps we better move on. Okay. Right. Moving on quickly. That was just to show they did use data. I'm going to talk actually about the Children's Attainment Project in Gosport because it's a very sort of micro example of how powerful positive deviance can be in a relatively short period of time. As you know, the government have issued the sort of 5-day parenting guidelines as well. Oh, I seem to have moved on without doing anything. That's clever. And that's fine, and children's centres are doing a fantastic job in terms of spreading the message and getting people along, but they're not always getting to the people that they need to. And what they're teaching is taught in often a very friendly but quite traditional way in terms of giving information. In one of the very early pilots, we looked at children's attainment in Gosport and aimed to do positive deviance absolutely properly. And we got a great group of mums together, and they identified specific aspects of attainment that they wanted to look at in terms of socialisation and communication skills, and we started off following the book. And we came across the gatekeepers. Having defined the problem and got all the data, we wanted to find the positive deviance. The group was ambitious and wanted to expand the geographical spread of what they were doing, and the original group came up against the problems of talking to parents in other areas or using schools as conduits because of all the policies, and rightly they have safety things, but it meant that the momentum suddenly was lost, and we had huge lead times during which time people got jobs and returned to work and dropped out of the group. However, one of the mums there said, this is a really good approach, and I like the fact that we don't get told what to do. We find out what works and do it ourselves, but I think we could do it quicker. She said, can I have a job? So I said, all right. So she said, children's attainment in Gosport is not good. It's at the lowest end of Hampshire and quite low in terms of national performance. And showing parents the data and sort of statistically that their children were at risk of not attaining as well as they might was quite a powerful recruitment tool. The Children's Centre offered us 4 weeks, 4 sessions once a week of 2 hours and a creche for 3 of the 4 sessions. So my colleague Jez designed what she called Speed PD as a means of getting the best out of the positive deviance methodology in the shortest possible time, and she did it about, broadly speaking, children's attainment. The Children's Centre did their normal approach to recruiting mums by putting leaflets and things out, but the Friday before the Tuesday that the first session was due to run, there was nobody signed up. So Jez used her Facebooking skills to use her social network to get 8 mums along by the following Tuesday, and all 8 stayed all the way through the 4 weeks. And we've had fantastic feedback, and the case study is available on our website, and I'm sure Involve would mind perhaps having it as well. So essentially what they did, they defined the problem in the first week, and again this is getting consensus. they brainstormed all the things that they were worried about as parents and felt that they didn't feel sure about in how to bring their children up. And there was all sorts of things like discipline and routines and sleep, reading, and they were facilitated to make a selection as which the thing that they wanted to focus on the most, given that they had very limited time. And the answer, which was a surprise to everybody, came up as messy play. Mums were really worried about actually doing messy play with their children. They weren't sure how to do it. They weren't that keen on getting stuck in. They weren't very keen on getting their homes into a mess, and they felt it was really difficult. So they worked on that. They did some internal observation and inquiry of things that they've done themselves, which are messy play, how they actually organised it. And everybody was an expert at something. Everybody had something good to contribute to the mix. And they took the learning from that and discussed what they wanted to do. Then they took the best practices and programmed them into a plan for the last week where there was no creche. And each mum was given tasks to do, and they all did them. They all collected data about what their children's current behaviour was like, their own levels of confidence, the number of times they have ever done messy play. And so they had a baseline to evaluate the success of the exercise from. And then on the last week, they actually did the messy play, and this is a photograph of the last session. Now you can see that not only are the children everywhere, but the mums are too. And one of the things that we've noticed with creche sessions, other creche sessions, is that both the creche workers and the mums stand back. Whereas in this session, everybody was together, everybody was helping each other, and they'd also planned how to stop doing messy play without tantrums. And they developed diversionary tactics in the form of food, and that enabled the mums to tidy up afterwards. And it was seen to be an enormous success. The Children's Centre is very pleased with it, but they're currently being outsourced, so we haven't been able to rerun it. But it's a very nice and tidy little case study, which is how we've tried to keep the core of Positive Deviance, to actually give people hope and encouragement, because all the mums were amazingly underconfident. And if you'd have given them a 5 a day, they'll all agree that that's what they want to do. But actually getting started and actually making the first steps on the route can be very hard. And, you know, that's not class or income specific. That can be hard for any new mum. Many people feel that they're pelted with so much information as a parent that they turn off. But the fact that they're actually able to explore between them and discuss and have examples of good practice enabled them to have a really good day. And the feedback that we've had is absolutely outstanding. We lectured on this, Jez and I, at the National College of School Leadership, and since then we've had, of the 13 people that came to our particular workshop, representing 13 different authorities, I'm just trying to tot up the number we've actually got moving forward, but about 4 or 5 of them are now going to be using Positive Deviance as part of their children's services strategy and training people up how to facilitate it. So that was the children's services one. You can also use Positive Deviance in organisations, although since we're very small we've only been working on the community projects recently. The first one I did was with Hertfordshire Adult Care Services, and this is where you have to balance the requirements of management, who wanted people to fill their paperwork in, with the Positive Deviance principle of framing the problem from the point of view of the group or the community. And so the first part of the session was to find people, volunteers, who would sign up, and then to reframe the problem in a way that they felt was resonant, and the way that the staff felt was resonant, that they didn't have time to do the paperwork. So the project became about making time for paperwork and making paperwork more streamlined. So the data collection was mostly about how people were using their time, and that was an extremely interesting exercise. Another bunch of social workers, not at Hertfordshire, told me that they'd had another big consultancy in recently to make them more efficient, and they told them, quote, what they wanted to hear. Here you had peers going in and asking them about how they were spending their time, so they knew they probably couldn't pull the wool over their eyes, but they needed proper data, so they actually went and asked people to keep a log of the time that they actually spent and agreed how they would do that so that it didn't become too intrusive. Another key thing was, this is not so much positive deviance, but it's an interesting change tool, is to have some kind of icon to exemplify the problem. And the icon in this instance was Eva's nan. And Eva's nan's experience of trying to find out what was due to happen to her, Eva was one of the team, sort of was held out as the kind of story that informed the whole process. And between them, the team realised that A, they weren't spending 80% of their time on paperwork, which was what the myth was. They then realised that, however, 30% of some people's time was being spent in dealing with calls from panicky people wondering where they were in the system that the contact centre hadn't been able to answer. So they changed the procedure to free up people's time, which saved a significant amount of time. And they also discovered that there were positive deviants in the organisation who had found devious and not quite official workarounds, which made filling the paperwork in an awful lot quicker. And through sharing those devious workarounds and having done a lot of ground preparing with the management team, they implemented the workarounds, and people generally saved between 1 and 2.5 hours a week right across the whole of the region that did this. So that's been seen as a success, and we still talk to Hertfordshire and they're interested in what we're doing in the community, so that's been moving on. So those are the main case studies. I was going to do a spot of academic stuff very, very quickly, but are there any questions again?
We just had one from Sam Axtell. Sam, do you want to speak to Jane directly? I'll just find you. You there, Sam?
No. Yeah, I'm here. Hi, everyone.
Hiya.
Hello.
Hi, Sam.
I suppose I just wanted to ask. I suppose as you've been going through, I've been thinking some of the approaches that you've talked about seem to have some similarities with systems thinking, and I wondered
yes.
if the methodology was based in any way on this.
It wasn't consciously based on systems thinking, because essentially it was just something that came out of nutrition that Jerry Sternin picked up and then applied much more widely. So he just took that sort of 5-stage process with variants sometimes where communities had to use data to see. I mean, it's been used, for example, for reducing female genital mutilation in Egypt, and sometimes you actually do some work with data to influence communities that there's a problem, in the same way as we did with Gosport, showing how much children's detainment was an issue. But in terms of systems thinking, yes, I mean, it is about making a small change in a system which then can ripple out and affect the whole of a system in a positive way. So I guess, yes it is, but not consciously.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's it for now.
Okay, there are some sort of relatively obvious things which I wasn't going to dwell on, primarily with positive psychology and looking at asset-based approaches. So, you know, by focusing on what works but making it extremely practical is similar to AI, appreciative inquiry, but you are acknowledging a problem, which appreciative inquiry tends to go straight to the vision, and you're also looking in a very practical way about what works right now and how it works, whereas appreciative inquiry can take you back to a time when things did work, which may not actually be working still. So you don't have quite the number of quick wins. It's not to say that appreciative inquiry isn't very powerful, it is. But it's just a way of starting a ripple in a community to get that hope. And once you've done it, I mean, the 8 ladies from Gosport all want to go on to do more positive deviance, and they're willing to tackle things like domestic violence and anything you care to throw at them now, because they've got that confidence. And it is about self-organisation, because rather than forcing something on a system, to use that word. It's about helping the system, as in complexity science, to self-organise to tackle that particular problem. When we did this original slide, this is actually one of the ones from the lecture in Oxford. We also linked it to design thinking. Now, up until a couple of weeks ago, I haven't really got an awful lot to say about that, but people are starting to take an interest in positive deviance as being a way to perhaps inform people-centered pathways and experience-based service design, because of the essentially, I suppose, taking out the inquiry, observation and data collection aspects is very powerful, and also the group of the Saguru mindset is extremely powerful in that kind of approach. And there are elements that are similar to the Palo Alto School of Psychology, which is solutions-focused brief therapy. So there's a lot of different connections with positive deviance. You know, there are similarities and differences to asset-based community development, for example, but it's very much more about people's behaviour rather than looking at the other more concrete assets in a community that can be taken advantage of. So it's very much more about people in that regard. So that's where we started. One of the other things that we knew anyway, but I think it's become very much more a powerful message, is that positive deviance needs leadership in a number of different ways. And the best and most appropriate way of leading is adaptive leadership, which is very it's taught at the National College of School Leadership, which is where we were able to make this link. Ronald Heifitz's approach, which is about helping people to organise themselves again, getting on the balcony and looking at the issues from afar and creating activity and creative deviance. He uses the terms on the ground. And as you can see, the task of leadership consists of choreographing and directing learning processes, and PD is an extremely powerful community learning process. So our take on this, and Sue can very welcome to chip in, is that it's not just about involvement and participation and having input to other people's decisions, it actually ignites action. Another point, and an important one, is that the inquiry and data collection process, A, is very powerful, but it also helps to reach out into all parts of the community based on something, I suppose, that isn't power specific. It's inclusive, it's welcoming, it's not trying to, it's about asking, not telling. The process builds trust and mutual respect because everybody is a PD in some way or other, and it also helps to generate personal responsibility. As the Cambridge team found in the Home Office project, it's amazing how it de-victimises people. There was a lady from the Cambridge project who was herself a survivor of domestic violence. They came to an action learning session for the first time at the Home Office, and that group were holding hands as they came into the room because they were so anxious, and they were really worried about the fact that the group had got some men in it. And through going some more sort of learning exercises around PD and having fun, basically, because the other thing that we're being terribly serious here, but actually doing a PD exercise involves people actually having quite a lot of fun, and if it's facilitated in a way that it's enjoyable, people want to come back. But just going back to the main point of the story is that by the end of that action learning session, all of the Cambridge people who were the survivors were not holding hands anymore. They were mixing with all the groups very happily, and they hugged everybody before they left when they went home. And we went back to Cambridge recently, and one of the ladies came to do a presentation about what she was going to do. She's the lady that wants to take this out into the Muslim community. And she was sitting there calm, confident, extremely glamorous, and she said, "It's been great. It's just helped me understand that I'm a person that has just been through a really difficult time, but I'm still, you know, a perfectly competent, in control person." But it's done not by doing really deep stuff, it's just about done by changing day-to-day behaviour in a day-to-day way. So it doesn't depend on providing new facilities or football coaching or bringing other people like mentors or one-to-one coaches into the community. So, bringing this to a conclusion, we believe that positive deviance delivers hope. This is actually the action learning session where everybody hugged each other. Confidence, hope, because the ideas that come out are often completely off the wall, unexpected ideas and solutions. Nobody had any ideas of some of the ideas on parenting that professionals, I don't think, would have thought about putting nappies on back to front so the kids couldn't rip them off. It delivers empowerment, gives people a sense of initiative. It does help actually live a diversity because essentially if you bring a diverse group together, you get a lot of respect for the different coping strategies in that group. And as you do more complex exercises, which would, you know, if you were improving a service, you bring in all the stakeholders, it does create a kind of system and enables the system to talk to different parts of itself. So, comment that it's about the involvement and participation but igniting action that really is the critical thing that really gets this going and fires people up and gets energy. So I'll take more questions if there are some at the end, but we like this quote from Lao Tzu: go to the people, live with them and learn from them. I can't quite read all the quote because I've just covered it with the I've got it on paper. Appreciate them, start with what they know, build with what they have, and with the best of leaders, when the work is done, the people and the task accomplished, the people will say, we have done this ourselves. And that's really the root of the positive deviance approach. So, quick revisit of the process just to prove that there is one. We find people get terribly upset that we don't go into this in great detail in webinars and things, but now isn't really the time. I think the point is that it's there. It may look familiar, but the way you do it isn't. And we were asked about reading and contacts. There is a book about positive deviance called The Power of Positive Deviance, which was written by the people that taught me, who were Richard Pascal, Jerry and Monique Sternin. Sadly, Jerry Sternin died in 2008, so positive deviance practitioners around the world are sort of trying to build on that. But his work has been picked up in a number of ways. It's been cited in Switch, which is about how to change things when change is hard. There's a lot of reflection of some of the key themes in the connected community, and in the book Connected, about the power of peer pressure. And also in Drive, which is about people's motivation and how people like to have autonomy and like to feel that they're in control. And that sort of thought process sits behind the whole of the positive deviance approach. So that's basically my bit over. Any more questions would be very welcome. We have developed in Woodward-Lewis a more strategic approach to how to use positive deviance exercises to train people, which could be ones in the workplace before then rolling it out in the community to get a safe start and to get to understand the different mindset that's actually required. But we've found that actually training community members like Jez that works with us is incredibly powerful, and how much talent there is out there. So I leave by recommending this to you and wait for any further questions.
There's nobody with their hand up at the moment. Sue, do you have anything to add at the moment?
No, nothing really on that. I was just wondering what people are thinking.
We'll never know.
To me, I mean, it tends to, what we find when we talk to people, it sort of leaves people hopefully slightly more confused than they entered the discussion, and we think that's a good thing. because that might encourage you to find out a little bit more about it and maybe go and speak to people that have done it to see what they learn, because I suppose the message out of all of it is a process, but the tips that you find are the really powerful tools for change. So whenever you work in a community, you'll find different solutions wherever you go. So you don't, a bit like if you think about the Vietnam example, some people were putting shrimps in their rice, but you couldn't then go, okay, national policy is everybody needs to eat shrimps, because that doesn't always work. So it's about working with communities on their terms to ask the questions that they're interested in, to find the solutions that work for them in their community and in the context that they're working in. And that's different to what we normally do. And if you think about the whole policy agenda around localism, about big society and all of that, the methodology just fits perfectly with all of that. But it does require, I think, the biggest lesson is that policymakers themselves have to really change their mindset. And it's not that they're not bought into this as a methodology, because I think people are. They agree with most of it. It's difficult to disagree with what we're doing, but actually in practice, then people tend to revert to type and they want to do things the way that they've done them before. And the biggest challenge for us has been to say, no, don't do it like that. Trust us. Because the thing for me, especially with the Home Office pilots, was we don't need to work through partnerships or agencies to get to the public. I can walk out of my front door now and go and speak to the public if I so desire. But yet the UK experience has been that to get to the public you must go through local government, you must go through police, you must go through the VCS and all of that. But you don't. We can go out and do it with the public whenever we want to. But if we are going to accept that the findings from the process need to be heard by those people in positions of power, then they need to be involved in the process. And it's just a warning to anyone who's thinking about doing it, is allow enough lead-in time. Even if you think you're completely bought into this, it will be challenging for you at times. It'll be a really positive, good challenge, and you'll enjoy all of it. And, you know, yes, there'll be loads of fun as you do it, but it will be a challenge. So just allow time at the start to kind of play a bit with your mindset. Once it kicks off, then there's no stopping it, and the community work much quicker than anybody in the public sector.
Yes, here, Sue. Totally agree.
There's something just come in about disempowering, so let's just have a read of that. I think what you mean there, Emma, is that sometimes when we have community champions and we sort of hold them up as good citizens, if you like, other people look at them and think, yeah, but I haven't got the time to do that, or it's not really what I want to do, or like you say, they feel a bit inadequate. I think what's really nice about Positive Deviance is because it takes an asset-based approach, it's not looking for what's wrong with a community, it's looking for what's right in that community. So when people find Positive Deviance, they, like we said before, usually they don't know they're a Positive Deviant, so when they find out that they are, they feel really quite good about that process and that new identity, if you like. And because it's been so matter-of-fact and straightforward with them, then they share that with others. So there doesn't seem to be a kind of, we would avoid any, look at this person, aren't they fantastic, but focus on what the data is telling us and then what the practice is around that. So we wouldn't say, look at this person, they've done a really good job and maybe you all want to copy that. The residents themselves would decide whether they want to copy it or not based on the fact that the data has shown them that it works.
Yes, I think it's really important. In the UK, the culture is not to make heroes out of people, and the methodology is very much about, as Sue said, the practice, not the person. And also, but it is also, in terms of facilitation, as we did with the parents, that everybody is good at something. And the facilitation will bring out what people are good at as well, and you know, reinforce that. So I've not found yet any self-blame going on in the kind of interventions, and the feedback would certainly indicate from the people that are doing it that that doesn't happen.
Andy's just said it looks like it could be an empowering tool, especially with some disadvantaged communities where they might be reluctant to take responsibility for their own actions and want someone else to solve their problems. I think it's really empowering in that context. And sometimes their solutions are things that we may have tried and tested in the past, and for some reason or another they didn't work, and I would say that some reason or another is probably because we told them to do it, whereas if they come up with their own answers and solutions to the problems, then even if we've done it before, if it works for them and it means they change their behaviour and crime reduces or health improves, then great, so long as it works, that's all we're interested in really. So yes, it is very empowering, I think.
Yeah, there's a comment about sometimes people in disadvantaged communities seem reluctant to take responsibility for their own actions and want someone else to solve their problems for them. Yes, that can be quite challenging from having done some pilot work with that. Again, that often goes around how we recruit people into the group. Rather than going for the usual suspects who often are seasoned campaigners for somebody to do something in that particular community, getting a group of people who probably may well be positive deviants in their own right, but who do feel that something is important enough to do something about. It's amazing how you can just start to make very small steps about pushing the responsibility back. And we had examples again in Gosport where people started to realise that if they wanted to stop kids playing, maybe playing with them or diverting them across to the park would be a good thing and wasn't a major thing for the police. So another one that I can think of not far away from there in Havant, we didn't finish because we unfortunately ran out of funding, and it was a very early one. But often, as you're probably all aware, the problem that presents itself initially isn't necessarily the worst problem. It is the one that they want something to do, somebody else to do something about. But there's often an underlying problem in terms of, which is a behavioural one, which could be something like bullying or intergenerational attitudes, where no one else can do something about it except them. So getting that out in the open, you can start to see that there's some steps forward you can take.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think we've run out of our allocated time. I wanted to first of all say a huge thank you to Jane and Sue for taking the time to take part in the webinar. It's been absolutely fascinating. I found it really interesting. I'm very keen to explore this further. Also a huge thank you to everyone who's taken the time to take part. We've had lots of questions and comments and thoughts, and that's great. Obviously, a huge thank you to the LGA and to NESTA for running the Creative Councils process and its fascinating sub-projects, and also for making this webinar possible. Do make sure you check out Sue and Jane's respective websites. Go and explore things further. Do let us know all your feedback about the webinar, what you liked, what you didn't like, and if you have any topics that you think we should cover in future ones. The next webinar is in 2 weeks' time. So that's on the, I believe it's on the 16th at 12 to 2:30. Also 1:30, and that is on community engagement and elected representatives. So if you are an elected representative or a politician, or you work with elected representatives and politicians, or you just find it very difficult to combine consultations and public engagement with elected representatives, local councillors, etc., then that is the session for you. Mary Reid, who's talking then, has got over 10 years experience as a local councillor. She's done lots of work at the national level, and she's got a great understanding of politics as well as public engagement. So it's a great combination, and we're very pleased to have her speaking in 2 weeks' time. But yeah, once again, a huge thank you to Sue and to Jane for taking the time to contribute to the webinar series in such a fulfilling way. I found it absolutely fascinating, and just given the volume of Twitter traffic, I think it's been amazing. So thank you all very much. I hope many of you can tune in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward.
Thank you very much from me too.